Hello, Apna, and thank you for hosting me again to present this presentation virtually, where we did it live last fall. Today, I'm going to talk about bias and what it is, and some examples of it, and as well as how we can mitigate it in our own processes as we work with families and maybe even our own employees. Um, the important thing about bias is we all have it. And I think the first time I presented this, I called it avoiding bias. And I've changed that to mitigating bias because I don't want to ever give the impression that we can ever fully remove it from our process. It's basic to who we are. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But minimizing the effect of bias in our candidate selection process is critical to making sure our families are well served, and also to make sure that we're serving our nanny community and the broader community well, by practicing some best practices around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I want to start by talking a little bit about DEI and diversity training. Although it's estimated that the US in 2020, particularly after George Floyd's murder, the US spent about $3.4 billion on diversity training. According to this meta study in the Annual Review of Psychology, there's almost no proof that most of what we do as diversity training actually works. And that should be alarming, right? Because we want to be effective in building diverse workforces and making sure diverse communities are well represented in all parts of our society. The biggest problem with what we've done so far, especially over the last 15, 20 years, as far as diversity training, is that we've trained managers to think about bias and decisions that lead to a lack of diversity without a just cause. We've trained our managers to attribute that to individuals' bad actions. These are intentional decisions people are making. These are bad actors. And perhaps I'm an optimist, but my truth is that most people want to be fair. Most people want to understand other people, and so when we dismiss a lack of diversity, or we dismiss processes that result in a lack of diversity, that well, it's just that person's fault, then we're not addressing the systemic problems that we have in our organizations, maybe in how our families think, and in the larger society. And the reality is, we've got to quit focusing on that one person and changing that one person's heart and mind, because that may well be almost impossible. We're not going to fix those people. What we need to do is make sure that we've built processes that make it harder for those individuals unintentional and our own unintended biases to affect the outcome of employment decisions. All of the articles that are referenced here will be included in the slides too. So, but this, the reality is, what we really have been doing is training people to answer the questions the right way. We're not changing their hearts and minds, but we're training them to say, oh, well, yes, of course, I'm not, I recognize what, that I should hire people regardless of relationship to their age, race, sexual orientation, national origin, any of those things. We train them to say the right things, but we don't change their hearts and minds. What changes people's hearts and minds is experience, working alongside that person. When you think back to my early career 30 years ago in HR, it was not uncommon in the workplace to hear jokes about gay people. And they weren't meant to be uh, generally uh, mean or negative. They weren't perceived that way, at least by most of the people in the straight community, but they were certainly hurtful to people who were in those communities. And but we didn't even know who was gay in our, it was not a thing that we realized. And so our lack of understanding, our ignorance was playing in those decisions. But then what happened? Throughout the 90s and especially the late 90s and the early aughts, we started realizing, oh, that person I've worked next to for the last 5 years in the next cubicle is gay. And what do you know? They're not eating babies. They're not horrible people. They're industrious. They're just like everybody else. They've got the same foibles. They've got the same strengths and weaknesses. They're just people. And if you look at the progress we've made in the subsequent 2 decades, it's not a thing in most organizations that somebody's gay. And that's from experience. It's not because we as organizational leaders beat it into people's heads, you have to like gay people. What happened is our individuals' attitudes changed because of their experience. And so we give people those kinds of experiences by having systems in place. And we're going to talk about some kinds of bias to maybe make us more aware of them in ourselves. But we're going to spend some time talking about systems today because I think systems are the answer to a lot of these challenges. Now, of course, we're all familiar with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, and we know that a lot of states and even local municipalities have their own rules about and protected classes and their own human rights commissions. But we don't want to discriminate on age, race, sex, national origin, or religion, or a host of other issues. And but complying with federal, state, or local law is just the minimum because you have to be pretty overt and intentional in your discrimination in order to get in trouble there. What we're going to talk about mostly today are the more subtle things that play into our decision making sometimes if we're not really paying attention to them. So let's talk about bias. If I go to my favorite restaurant, I have biases against certain things. I eat low carb and low starch, and I don't eat sugar. And so I'm going to have biases against a plate I love chicken and rice, but because of my diet, my bias is against the chicken and rice plate because I don't eat rice. And so is it a bias or is it a preference? Well, in more recent conversations and the way we use bias is usually conceived of as a negative preference, and a regular preference is just something I just prefer. In reality, there's really no difference. The real reality is that what I like is a preference, and what you like is a bias, right? And so the idea that bias or preference are really that there's some, there may be some nuance there, especially in how it's used colloquially. But my main concern is that we have preferences, biases, attitudes that direct us or steer us, even subtly, in a certain direction. So the reason that we need our managers, our hiring managers, even our families who are hiring, to understand what is a preference or a bias is because we want to give them the best candidate possible. And sometimes those preferences or biases sometimes they're nice to haves. And there's nothing wrong with something that's a nice to have if it really will produce a better outcome. But sometimes it's just, well, they've got this idea in their head, and it doesn't really affect the outcome at all. And when we start letting managers or hiring managers or families ideas, just maybe past experiences, things like that, affect the hiring decision, then we're not serving them well. They may be missing out on a better ultimate candidate because they've got this idea in their heads about what they want to, who they want to choose. So let's go through a few examples of bias. I'm going to go through these quickly because we're on a tight time schedule, but appearance bias. Studies show that conventionally attractive people are given more credibility. And well, I get it. You know, as somebody who's not that conventionally attractive person, I felt at times that, well, the only person that guy got that job was because, he's 6'1" and, he's got a big square jaw and he's just a good looking dude. I get it. But does that really affect for most jobs that someone's ability to do it? Not really. Then there's the affect heuristic that it comes in play where we let irrelevant details that someone has selected to demonstrate about themselves or the way somebody's decided to present themselves to you affects your evaluation. And certainly clothing is a good example. And we all have, certain clothing styles, right? I mean, if I'm on stage or at a conference or doing a webinar or on my podcast, this is my uniform. I've got a jacket, a pressed shirt, and a pocket square. That's kind of the Mike Coffee thing, and jeans and boots. Okay, that's my heuristic. People, if somebody sees me in tennis shoes, they're like, "What are you doing?" And you must be going to yoga right now, and probably am. So, but does that really make me a better background check investigator or a better company owner or a better speaker because of those things? No, that's just my uniform. And what we need to remember as we're hiring nannies or other kinds of employees that how much is that affect heuristic affecting our opinion of this person, because it's an affect. It's typically something someone's chosen to do, and if they're otherwise fully qualified, we can probably help them modify their appearance to be appropriate for the setting that they're looking at going into. And so you may have a family that is particularly conservative and wants, if it's a nanny, maybe they don't want sleeveless or sleeveless blouses. Well, that's fine. The nanny comes to your interview and she's got a sleeveless blouse. We can talk to her about that. But just because somebody meets a certain is savvy enough or had the good advice of a friend to dress a certain way or to otherwise represent themselves, we don't want to let that get in the way of our hiring decision. And then there's the affinity bias. Well, we have something in common with this candidate, so we like them a little better, and we just clicked with them. And so that doesn't have anything to do, though, with the fitness for their role. And so we need to remember that. Now, maybe they have maybe they're members of APNA, okay, well, or INA or some other group that we're a part of, and we say, oh, that tells me that they are actively plugged into their community like I am. And so they've got these professional networks or this professional community. Well, maybe that's true. Or maybe they joined APNA or INA or whatever, and they never participated. So just because they're a member of that group doesn't mean that they're active in it. And so, okay, you're a member of, if we're talking about nannies, you're a member of INA. Great. Tell me what you've learned at INA. What webinars have you attended, or what material resources have you used, and dig deeper into it. Just the fact that they're a member of it, or even worse yet, has nothing to do with the job. Maybe it's just the fact that they like my sports team, or they went to the same school I did, or something like that. That is not job related, but internally we often click with people who we have some affinity for. Similar to affinity bias is similarity bias. The fact that someone looks or acts like we do, we automatically like them more. And so, and I'm that guy. If I find another extrovert, somebody who likes to talk, somebody who wants to go have a meal and chit chat and just blow the afternoon off over drinks, I'm on board. I like this person. But does that mean that person is going to be the right person for the job, that they're fully competent and they have all the skills? Probably not. That in and of itself doesn't mean that they're going to be good in whatever role. In fact, it may mean that they're going to be worse in it. You try to put me in an introvert's job, a job where I'm sitting in front of 2 or 3 computer monitors all day doing really repetitive work, I'm going to die. And so if I was going out to lunch to hire somebody for an analyst role, and I really enjoyed them, oh yeah, he's going to be great. And then I put him in front of that job, I'm setting him up for failure. So we need to realize that just because somebody's like us doesn't mean that they're the best candidate for the job. And then similar to that is the likability. We always hear the, is this somebody I'd want to have a beer with test? And we say that about politicians. We say that about employees. Is this somebody who's going to fit in our culture? And sometimes what we're really saying there is somebody we like often, because we really haven't defined our culture. Usually we don't know what our core organization values are, unfortunately. And I spend a lot of time with our consulting clients, helping them develop that stuff. But the fact that you just like somebody, you like to hang out with them, doesn't make them a qualified candidate. So actively avoid that likability test. And I think this is a real dangerous one that a lot of people fall into. And at the end, near the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more because I think it's a real trap. Then we have this process where often, rather than, maybe we're doing 5, 6, 7 different interviews with different candidates, and we fall into the trap of saying, okay, I've got candidates 1 through 6 here, and this is the best candidate because I'm comparing this candidate to all these other candidates, rather than comparing first the candidate to the job. What are the competencies that we really need to have in order to successfully do this role? And so when we're looking at, well, this guy, I really like this one, but this person was a little better than this one. That's not what we should be doing. We should be saying, okay, this person has these competencies, and this person has this set of competencies. This is what the job requires. Where do we align? And picking the candidate based on how they fit the job description, much more than how they compared to the rest of the pool. Because maybe nobody fits your competencies. And nobody, maybe they're all 70% candidates, and you just happen to like this one and they stood out from the others because of whatever reason, then we're still going to end up with a subpar candidate. We need to go back out and look at our full, enlarge our applicant pool, find some other candidates to bring in, because what we're looking for is not who's the best candidate in this applicant pool. We're looking for who's the best applicant we can find who meets all these job criteria. Then there's attribution bias, where we look at somebody's successes or their failures, and without really digging into it, we attribute those successes or failures to things outside of our knowledge. So yeah, well, of course they went to Stanford. They were a rich kid. They were a rich kid who grew up with a silver spoon in their mouth. Do you know that's a fact? Or do you know that maybe this is somebody who went to Stanford because they worked extremely hard? Maybe they didn't come from a privileged or advantaged financial background. Maybe they even went to crappy schools and had to really work hard to get to the next level. You don't know. Just because we see something good, we don't want to discount it. And likewise, sometimes I think this has really become a trend and a negative outcome of a lot of the DEI mindset, is that we see people who have some, who have had some failures or struggles, and we see that they're in, some underprivileged class, and so we say, well, of course they did. They deserve an extra chance or a leg up because because of this failure, because we're going to attribute that they had some negative background experiences that led them to whatever this failure was. They dropped out of college, if that's a failure, or whatever else it was. But we don't know that until we explore it deeper and really understand what that person's journey was. So we just want to discount, give people extra credit for good things or bad things, or discount their successes, or because we think maybe just by gut we're going to attribute something, we're going to tell the story to ourselves about who they are without really exploring who that is. Then there's the idea of illusory correlations, where what we think led to, cause to something that we, either like or dislike, um, is only a correlation. It didn't really cause it. We look at, somebody who's been a really successful engineer. Well, of course, because they went to Texas A&M. Well, they got a decent education as an engineer, but is that really why they're so successful? Is that correlation or causation? And we really need to dive into conversations with candidates to understand the causation, because the causation is what tells us who that person is internally, how they behave, how they respond to adversity, um, and how they respond with grace to success. But we have to dig deeper into understanding where somebody came from, how they got where they are, before we just start telling ourselves again stories about who that person is. And then sometimes we have the halo effect, where we see something really positive in this person and we let it overshadow other things that are maybe other, negative or less strong areas in the selection criteria. So you have a nanny who, uh, you know, comes with a great reference from a family, and that's great. And this is a family y'all have worked with before, and you really like this, and it was a 6-month assignment, and they really loved her, and they say all these positive things about her. So we think, okay, she's great. But then when we get deeper into her history, there's other things. Well, or maybe we needed an NCS or we needed some special skill. Well, she doesn't quite have that, but she can probably get that. And we get these great references. We keep going back to that great reference, that great reference. But if we get into the rest of her history, it may be pretty mediocre. But we keep kind of pushing that stuff aside because we're so blinded by that halo. And you can tell this is a very old picture because my hair is dark, and it's not anymore. This is at one of my old yoga studio, and I thought it was a gag photo, and I use it way too much. So the halo effect is where we've got something positive that we're letting overshadow all the other selection criteria. So we're not evaluating everything maybe in the right proportion. On the flip side, we've got the horns effect. We're making somebody out to be a devil because of one negative issue in their background, and it's overshadowing in their background or in their skill set, one deficit in their skill set, but it's overshadowing all the other selection criteria. In Les Miserables, Inspector Javert refused to see Jean Valjean's meritorious efforts to improve his life, to care for his community, and all that, because all Javert can think of is what a negative thief he was, because he got caught and he went to prison for stealing bread to feed his sister. So that's the horns effect. Javert was never going to see the positive side of Jean Valjean. And so we want to avoid the horn effect and make sure we're looking at all the criteria, that we're getting the whole applicant in our understanding. And then there's intuition. We've all had that gut feeling. There's something not right about this person, or oh wow, this person, I just get it. That I really think they're going to be successful here. But we don't have any criteria to base that on. Now, our gut feelings should not be ignored. Pay attention to them, because we're trained to pattern recognition. We're trained to understand stuff and understand our surroundings and our environment very quickly. So the fact that we feel something about somebody may tell us, hey, I need to look deeper into this. What is causing this? We need some self-reflection, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we need to recognize it for what it is, though. It may not, it's in and of itself, it's not fair. It's a gut feeling. And so just because we've got our intuition telling us something doesn't mean that it's accurate. So we need to pay attention to it, but we also need to dig into understanding in ourselves where that feeling is coming from. And I've been working on meditation, so I'm catching myself more often saying, okay, I responded this way. That's interesting when this person says this. So before I respond, I can tell my heart rate went up, and I feel, I've been married 26 years, so I, on occasion, have cause to have a disagreement, and but often the disagreement is something inside of me. It's not my lovely wife's problem, and I'll say, okay, so I'm annoyed by this. Why am I annoyed by this? And 90% of the time, when I'm annoyed by it, it's got nothing to do with her. It's all about me. And so we need to ask ourselves, what is it about this person or about this situation that's causing this intuitive feeling about us? And then let's go explore that and see, is there something there or not? And then there's that confirmation bias. If we initially like somebody, or our initial evaluation of a circumstance is such that, yeah, I kind of get that. And I'm a very intuitive person. Um, so when I'm working with my team and we have a problem, I can often, boom, jump 5 steps ahead and tell them what the solution is. Now, it's not usually right, but I, you know, it's a trap if, as we start to dissect the issue and look at possible solutions and gather data and all of that, it would be a confirmation bias if I ignored data that disproves my intuitive belief and just reinforces my gut feelings and what I believe about it. And so we need to do that with applicants too. So both positive and negative. So there may be something, you didn't like the way an applicant worded an email. So as you get ready for the interview, you're kind of a little miffed about it, or you're not quite sure. So you get this negative impression that may or may not be relevant. But then they show up and they're amazing applicants. They've got all the competencies, experiences, and everything. But you're looking for those, rather than looking at the whole applicant and their qualifications for the job, we find ourselves looking into what it is about them that confirms our initial negative impression. Or on the flip side, you could do that with something positive as well. And then there's proximity bias, the fact that we favor the people that we interact with the most. Now, maybe in hiring a nanny, that's less often, unless it's a nanny that you've worked with for multiple years and you've got relationship with, or maybe they volunteered for International Nanny Training Day with you or something like that. But that doesn't make them the best candidate for a specific job. And in the corporate world, we're seeing a lot of proximity bias appear, where we have employees who've gone fully remote, employees who are working hybrid, and employees who opt to come into the office every single day, and the managers in the office every single day. And so corporate, as I'm talking to corporate leaders, often that's a challenge because they see Jane or Joe every day. And so Jane and Joe start getting better assignments. They start getting better projects. Doesn't mean they're the most qualified to do them, but he's right there. And so we've got that proximity. So we need to pay attention to how we make assignments and how we give promotions, and just what our feelings and evaluations of each employee is, apart from how often we actually interact with them on a physical basis. So one of my favorite books is James Clear's Atomic Habits. And one of the big things that really stuck with me out of there is, we often focus on outcomes. This is what we want to get to, and that's great. And a big part of that is changing our processes. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit. So it is important that we change our processes and think through the systems that we use. But one of the things that James Clear talks about is how important the story we tell ourselves, what our core identity is, because that addresses how we change processes and reach our outcomes. So if we're constantly telling ourselves, I'm the kind of person who challenges my own assumptions, and we really constantly tell that story to ourselves, that will help us to actually challenge our own assumptions and to use our processes and systems that we built to kind of disassemble those and understand what's really driving them. Or maybe we say, as an organization, as an agency, or as a business, we tell ourselves, leadership says it over and over, And we make sure everybody in the organization understands and is saying the same story. We're the kind of organization that focuses on competencies and positive outcomes. And we keep saying that. We're the kind of organization that doesn't let irrelevant information affect a hiring decision. We constantly say that we're the kind of organization that's fair to every applicant. We're the kind of organization that's willing to tell a family no, even if it means losing a commission when we think what they're asking us to do is unethical. We constantly tell that story, and that makes a giant difference in how our whole team adopts changes in our process and focuses on the outcomes that we want to achieve as an organization. So again, as I said earlier, mitigating bias means practicing mindfulness, examining our own reactions from a detached position. It's interesting that I was really favorable to this candidate. Why was that? Or I had this really negative impression of this candidate. What caused that? And as you disassemble that, what of it's relevant and what of it's not? Again, often our initial impressions are accurate, but sometimes we always need to really break down, understand what they are, and make sure that they're not leading us astray. And that boils down to systemizing and standardizing how we define and market a role, how we recruit, right? How we collect and analyze candidate information, and how we make the hiring decision. Systems give us the framework. I know many nanny agencies are using the entrepreneurial operating system to run their business. And it's all about putting simple systems in place that make it easier for you to operate your business and not recreate the wheel every time. But I see employers all the time recreating the wheel when it comes to hiring an applicant. They hire this applicant differently than they hire this one, and differently than they hire this one. And that's going to be very variable in your success. So you can't measure success over a bunch of applicants. Whereas if you put a system in place, you test it for a period, then you can go back and modify it because it doesn't seem to be serving us as well here. What can we do to do a better outcome in this area? So you've got to have systems to make this work. And it also means that in your new client onboarding, you have a conversation with the family to explain to them what your system is. Here's how we do it. Here's how we are going to present to you the most qualified candidates that we can find. And these are the steps we're going to take to remove irrelevant information from our hiring decision. And this is what we need from you as a family who's hiring. Don't let the families force you to be unfair in your hiring decision. And now this boils down to an ethical issue. And depending on what they ask you, it may not be job related, but you may say, okay, this is minor enough and it's not really going to impact a large group of candidates unfairly, but it's kind of dumb or whatever. You may say, well, yeah, we'll live with that. But we all have to decide for ourselves what's right and wrong for our business. And there's going to have to be a line someplace in the sand where you say, tell a family, you know what, we want to get you the best candidate, but we're not going to engage in that kind of unfair evaluation. So we need a job description, and we need the internal job description that we use for a nanny role or for somebody we're hiring in an organization. It needs to have selection criteria that are directly related to the role's responsibilities. And, I know when you're hiring nannies, it's not tab A and slot A. Every family has different needs. Every kid's different. Every family circumstances are different. Or, you've got all these different dynamics. And you need to find the right person for that position. So your criteria is probably going to be different from every single nanny. And internally, we need to make sure we and the family are on the same page and have really built out a job description that's clear and it shows the competencies that this nanny is going to need to work in that organization. What we often have are nice to haves. And it would be nice to have this, it'd be nice to have that. Now those are preferences that maybe the family's expressing, and maybe they are nice to haves, but often they're not critical to the success in the role. And we get into that risk of saying, oh, they've got these nice to haves, so we'll overlook maybe the more routine but really important bedrock competencies that the nanny has to have. And so you've got Bonnie Tyler's description of her ideal man. I got the news for you, Bonnie Tyler. That is not the prescription for a happy marriage. Okay, that's a this is a fun weekend. This is not a happy marriage. And so these are all nice to have. So what we really need are core competencies. And on the other side, we often over focus on credentials. And so there is a giant movement over the last few years in the business community to move away from especially college degrees. The fact that somebody got a psychology degree 20 years ago and hasn't used it professionally doesn't make them qualified for a job that just requires a bachelor's degree. Okay, what's even a computer science degree 20 years ago, but somebody's not been working in computer science for the last 20 years. I want somebody who's worked in this area for 20 years, then the kind of computer science work, the coding or whatever it is that they're doing that is directly relevant to me. I don't care if they ever got a degree, but we have this tendency to over credentialize, especially your hiring managers. Your families may well do it too. Oh, well, I've got to have a nanny with a college degree. Do you? And maybe that's a conversation to have. Now, there are there are nanny agencies that really are big. That's a big giant part of their marketing, and they really focus on making sure that they have these highly credentialed nannies. I'm not saying that's wrong. What I'm saying is in your conversations with your family, really understand when they say they want these credentials, what does that really mean? What is that going to get them? And you've got to educate them because they don't know. And that's what we fall down to when we're hiring a position and we don't know all the details. We tend to over credentialize. We say, okay, well, they just need to check all these boxes, and we're probably going to be okay. Well, that may not be true. What the person actually can demonstrate that they've done and can do in recent history is much more important than credentials they may have gained at some point in the distant past. And we've all been there, and we know the scales don't lie. We have to add new measurements to our recruiting scorecard. How are we going to measure success? If we really want to do a better job in mitigating bias, how do we do that? We need to have measurements in place. For example, as a nanny agency owner, maybe you need to think about, okay, we need all our candidates are kind of looking the same, and we want to be able to make sure we expand our nanny pool so that our families have better selection candidates to choose from. So maybe we need to go to non-traditional recruiting sources. Maybe the way we've been doing it, posting it on Indeed, on care.com or whatever, is not the best way to always get as deep a good and diverse a candidate pool as we want. And so where else can we do this? There are all kinds of job boards focusing on individuals from different backgrounds, and many of your chambers of commerce, especially like your Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, your Black Chamber of Commerce, things like that, have their own job boards. So maybe you reach out through them, and maybe you think, well, no nanny is going to be looking at the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce job board. That's probably true, but you know who he is? Other Hispanics, and maybe they know, hey, this would be the perfect job for my sister. She's looking, she would be qualified for this. She meets this requirement. I need to show her this job posting. So it may be just a referral source. But but if we decide that, that's our goal, we're going to recruit from more non-traditional sources. Let's set a measurable goal so that in 3 months, 6 months, a year, we can say we've made this progress. we've posted, X% of our jobs or all of our jobs in these other sources. And then we can measure the results. Did that give us a more diverse candidate pool? Did it give us a more diverse qualified candidate pool? And we can evaluate it. And if it didn't work, we go try something else. But the idea is whatever we want to do, we want to measure. And maybe I don't like counting noses. Personally, I don't like the idea of saying X% of our candidates should be diverse of some sort, because we're all diverse. We're all different people. And just looking at the amount of melanin in somebody's skin, or their country of origin, or things like that are easy to see, but often shouldn't be relevant in hiring decision. I'm not a big fan of doing that. If you want to do that, that's fine. Measure that. But what I would argue is that measure things like candidates who came from outside of our network. And I would argue you should have 30 or 40% of your candidates who came from outside of your normal network, outside of referrals, so that you're constantly not just getting people from the same bubble. But you got to change your scorecard. You got to have measurements that make sense. And then let's look at the job posting language. And this is the one that got me in trouble at APNA. We had a pretty robust discussion about it at the conference last fall. But let's pay attention to the language we use. If you say, I'm looking for an energetic nanny, what are you telling a 45 or 50-year-old nanny? You're probably telling her, or what she's going to hear is that, well, they want somebody young. And energetic, I'm 53. I know I don't look it, but I'm 53 and I'm energetic. I work out every day. I do yoga. I do a lot of stuff. I'm energetic. I can keep up with a 5-year-old. Wouldn't want to, but I could. So maybe what we need to say in the job description instead of energetic is we need someone who can actively participate in sporting activities with a 9-year-old twin boys. I don't want to do that, but there are people who will say that, and, oh, I can do that. But energetic doesn't give them enough information to know what you're really looking for. On the other flip side of the coin, mature. We're looking for a mature nanny. Well, I've known 30-year-olds who were much more mature than some of my 50-something friends. And so what we're really looking for is experience, right? So experience managing the transportation schedule of multiple kids at multiple schools and many different activities. Okay, that's mature. So let's describe the actual things we're looking for rather than these simple adjectives that really don't give the candidates enough information, because what you're going to do is have certain candidates, otherwise fully qualified, self-select out because they're reading into your job description, your job posting, what you may not have intended to be there. And people pushed back at the APNA conference, and I don't own a nanny agency, but I would argue that the term nanny could be misinterpreted as men need not apply. It may be accepted as both sexes, or whatever gender, but using that term nanny, it does have a connotation with females. And so especially if the family's expressed, hey, we're really comfortable with male or female, then make sure your job posting expresses that. Even if you're going to call it nanny, nothing wrong with that, but make sure your job description expresses that you're open, and I hope you almost always are, to a male nanny. So think about that language. And we're running out of time, but I just want to say resumes are polite lies. Okay. Make all of your applicants go through the same process, because somebody says, oh, well, the resume tells me if they're creative or if they've got attention to detail. No, it doesn't. What the resume tells you is, did they do it themselves? Did they just get some template off Microsoft Word, which are all ugly and weird fonted? I don't know why Microsoft even keeps them in there, but or they hired somebody who did a really good job for them, somebody who knows how to make an aesthetically pleasing resume, which again has nothing to do with the competencies. So having every applicant go through an actual application process before you're sorting them, because too often we look at resumes, yes, no, yes, no. Now I'm going to have these 5 applicants do applications. Don't do that. There's so much bias in just looking at pieces of paper that I think every applicant, if I could get all my clients to get rid of their resume acceptance and make everybody go through the same process, it'd make a giant difference in their outcomes as far as the quality and diversity of the candidates. Then, where you can by state or local law, I'm a big believer in asking the criminal history question up front, a very thorough question where they tell you everything. They open their code. And I think that's really important because when accompanied by language that says, hey, we're going to be fair in our evaluation of it and we're going to look at it fairly, that's important. But this way, you're getting all the information. So as we're sorting through our candidates, we can look at the whole applicant each time rather than, and we know what's relevant and what's not. And hopefully, I've got the webinars recorded on our website that are free and talk through all the process of setting up your criminal history policy and how you should evaluate it to make sure you're legal, but also fair. And then another thing you may think about is looking at your applicant tracking system. What I, as a 53-year-old white guy, considers an unusual name, which basically means it's not typical of a white person of my generation. These unusual names lead to conscious, sometimes conscious, and some often unconscious bias. And sometimes and I've talked to nanny agency owners who've told me this. I just hate to give a name that sounds extremely ethnic to this family as a nanny opportunity. Okay, well, get over it. But what if you used your applicant tracking system or your process, even if it's a person who's not involved in the hiring process to do it, removing all the names from the applications as you're reviewing these candidates. And so we're really focused in on competencies and we're not letting our biases about, maybe even remove the address. So we're not letting our biases about where the part of town this person lives in or their name or things that aren't relevant to the job. Don't give you any insight into their competency or their behavior. Let's move those out of the process. Now, and I know that seems like a really unusual, hard thing to do. It's not that hard in most systems. And then use reliable tests of both. I'm a giant believer in behavioral assessments, and reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about them. I don't sell them, but I'm a giant believer in using behavioral assessments and cognitive skills. Define for the job what cognitive abilities you need, and then find a way for your applicants to demonstrate those. Sometimes that's in the application process. You ask them to write a story. Tell me about a time where, boom, 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 especially if it's something unique with that family, to see what kind of experience they have in that area. And then definitely, before you're sending them to the family, when you're interviewing them, dig deep. Behavioral event interviewing is still a thing, and it's really important. Tell me about a time when, and see what they told you. They can tell you about that. Then remember, and I think most of us are getting this more and more, Zoom isn't the same as in real life. So if you're doing interviews over Zoom, realize you're going to have weird backgrounds. There's going to be a dog barking. Amazon's going to deliver a package and ring the doorbell. That doesn't make the applicant unprofessional. Some people are just not comfortable on camera, where in person they're fine. So give people some grace about this. Think about the interview environment. Does this look like an interview environment that is open and puts the candidate at ease so you can really get the idea who they are? It's not. Across the table, panel interview, there are ways to do it and soften the relationship. I like the interview sitting next to somebody. I like an interview where I ask the applicant first what questions they have about the role. They've always had the full job description before the interview. I like to talk to them and dig deep into what interested them in this role. Get them talking. What questions do they have for me? have those conversations before we get into all the competencies and talk. Because I want them to first of all feel like it's a conversation, and second of all, be comfortable. But then also be willing to have the frank conversations you need about why they left their last role. What challenges did they have there? Oh, well, I see you had a DWI 5 years ago. Tell me about what happened there. Tell me about the circumstances. You've got to have those frank conversations, and it gives us liver quiver. We don't like to do it, but it's really key that we dig deep so that we can fairly evaluate, understand the background of what the applicant's telling us. Then use structured interviews. It's critical. We've all worked with difficult people. Tell me about a time where you're in a situation and how you responded to it. And ask those same set of questions to every single applicant. Make notes. You're not going to remember what this after 3 interviews. You're going to remember what applicant number 1 said versus number 2, number 3. You're going to go in your gut. Write down their responses and then score it on a scale of 1 to 10. When you're scoring it, don't score it against what other applicants told you. Score it against this criteria and go through this is so important, and so few people do it. Ask the same set of questions of every applicant for a specific job. Make the question specific for that role. And then again, evaluate credentials where they're related to the job. If that credential is not related to the job, still want to verify it, because people lie all the time, but don't let it overweight into the decision if it's not really relevant. And always look for an opportunity to give the applicant an opportunity to demonstrate their competencies rather than just the fact that they've got a credential. And so we've got these rating tools. We had our questions now. These are the competencies that we said we needed for this job, right? And this person's a 6 here, a 10 here, an 8 here. It's not a bell curve. We're not comparing them to the rest of the group. We're comparing them to the criteria directly. And here's what your notes were. So this process will make your life much easier. It takes some preparation, but it's a lot easier. And the last thing to put on that review is likability. And I told you earlier, likability is a bias. I want you to put it it's such a strong bias. I want you to put it at the end of your criteria and then discount it. Okay. So if you say, oh, wow, she's a 10, and we go back and we say, what did we like about her? She's a great personality, great smile, strong handshake, whatever it is. I'd love to get a glass of wine with her sometime. Okay. She's very likable. Doesn't mean she's going to be a great nanny for this particular job. And so by rating it and examining what we really liked, then we can go back and look at the rest of the criteria and say, yeah, my likability doesn't have anything to do with her competency. And then make sure that when the background check comes back, you don't over respond. Did you ask? I hear it all the time. I talk to clients who call me and say, hey, we're not going to hire this person. I'm really concerned about this person's background check. It came back with a 10-year-old DWI, and they didn't tell us about it. And my first question is, what did you ask them about it? Well, I asked them if there's anything I should know about before we ran the background check. Well, maybe they thought you didn't need to know about it. If you don't ask and you let them decide what's relevant, then don't get mad at the applicant when something comes back that you didn't expect. So be really specific in the questions you ask. Build that into your employment application. Follow up during the interview. Make notes. Have them give you written explanations of anything that's a red flag. Then ideally, the background check, which is so critical, comes back with nothing. You should have no surprises. When you actually have got a good process and you have your background check, it comes back, you got a good process, the background check comes back with something that's a surprise, that tells you may have a problem with your applicant. I've got a podcast that drops every Thursday, Good Morning HR, the business podcast, where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Every Thursday, it's about half an hour, sometimes 45 minutes. And I got a couple of years worth of episodes out there, and they're all still relevant. Thank you, Apna, for the time. I know I'm about to jump on live to answer any other questions you have. So I appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing everybody at the next conference.
Well, we are back. That was an amazing session, full of information. I feel like we need to revisit all of our processes. Let's just like take a comb and go through every last one of them. We have quite a few questions on the board, so we're going to do our best to roll through as many as we can get to in the next 10 minutes. So, how do you mitigate biases from prospective candidates with strong accents? Even the recruiter has a hard time understanding their answers to the interview questions.
Well, I think the first question is how important is communication in this role, and that this person be easy to understand. And I'd argue in many roles it's not that important, but in a domestic environment, working with kids, small children, things like that, that may be a relevant, the ability to communicate in a way that's easy to understand for a 5-year-old may be completely relevant to the job. What you've got to do, though, is recognize your initial response to that accent or any of these other things we've talked about, appearance and all those other things, and say, okay, let me practice some mindfulness here and think about what is it that's driving this feeling. Okay, I'm going to set my feelings apart. Now let me think about what we really need for a successful candidate in this role, and then re-examine it. Because there are times where, quite honestly, the accent, I'm sure that I was in Colombia a few weeks ago, and my Spanish is passable. Not in Colombia, it's not, because their accent's completely different. And they asked me several times, are you Mexican? Because they couldn't understand what I was saying. And I speak probably more Tex-Mex type Spanish than certainly Colombian. So, but it may be really relevant in some environments. So I don't think in and of itself, it's a problem if you've considered it and you've made a conscious decision that this is relevant.
Gotcha. Great insight. Another question is, in your opinion, how does ageism affect this industry?
I think it does, and I touched on it, I think it does like in every job. We have, largely culturally, we've got a bias towards youth. And maybe 20 years ago, I didn't mind that so much. Now that I'm at my current age, it's 53 doesn't seem that old. But I think it's probably in this industry and just about every other one. It's a reality. And it goes back to educating your clients. And like I said, talking in the job description, describing the role in the job description beyond something like just energetic or things, describe the kind of activities that person's got to participate in. That'll really get you more applicants who don't feel like they're going to be discounted just because of their age.
Great insight on that as well. How do you explain to clients that some of their expectations aren't legal to ask?
I think that's the easy one.
Right.
You just tell them, okay, that one is, well, here's what Title VII and Civil Rights Act covers, or here's what our state, or even if you really look, some of your most rigorous civil rights ordinances are at the local level. The local cities and counties, long before any states or even in the ESC or federal, were protecting people on gender identity and things like that. So pay attention to those local things. But just telling your client, hey, this is illegal.
Yeah.
The real trick, though, is if your client has fewer than 15 employees, Title VII doesn't apply to them. And so if they've got one employee, this is a household with 1 or 2 employees, that's you're not going to be able to rely necessarily on legal protections. And that's when you get into the ethical thing. And the first question you've got to ask yourself is, ethically, as an employer, am I going to indulge this client's unreasonable and unfair biases? And sometimes you have to tell clients, no, I'm not willing to do that. Yeah. And, I'll walk away from this fee because I want to do right by my candidates. And I only want to serve clients who want to be served well. And I can't serve them well if they won't be educated, and if they won't, if they don't want to hire the very best person I can present to them, regardless of whatever their biases are.
Oh, I appreciate the assertiveness of your response. What is the fine line that separates one from being accused of discrimination versus following your policies and procedures you have set for your agency and want to be known for?
I wouldn't worry if I feel like my policies and procedures are fair and non-discriminatory, both in the black and white review of them, but also in how they're actually practically implemented in our organization, I'm not so worried about being accused of it. People are going to accuse you. Every applicant you've ever had thought they were the most qualified person for that job. And they will often think that if they didn't get the job, there was something wrong with your evaluation, that it
Right.
wasn't fair. And so I wouldn't sweat being accused of discrimination. What I'd be worried about is always making sure that even if it's not a legal issue, that I can defend, not that I necessarily owe every applicant who's upset a defense, but that I know internally that I made the right decision on behalf of this family and that my processes and procedures were fair.
Last question that we have time for. How can you sometimes ignore your intuition when it's negative?
I think it goes back to that mindfulness thing, that separate, being really aware of it. And that's why I like having likability as something I'm actually going to document on the application so that I can think about it and recognize it and then make a conscious effort to remove it from the rest of the consideration. And I think that's what it really boils down to. Your intuition is what it is. Humans are hardwired for pattern recognition. It kept us alive on the savannas for, millennia, but now it's not as relevant as it used to be in many of especially in our personal interactions. And so we just have to be able to say, okay, I get that. I see what my favorable impressions are or my negative impressions are, but I need to step back and be more objective. And I think only way we can do that is by recognizing them first.
I appreciate that so much. Well, people, I hope that you are looking at your processes through a new lens, hopefully a clearer lens. After we've had this wonderful session with Mr. Mike, we will be back at about 1:05 for our next session. You don't want to miss it. From adversaries to teammates, conflict resolution with Miss Susie Zeldin. We'll see you shortly. Talk soon.